The God of Thunder is one of the first people I went to for inspiration when making themed builds, mainly because of how perfectly certain subclasses fit his powers. For this video, I'm going to be taking inspiration from both the Norse god Thor and the Marvel Comics character. The main objective with Thor was to cover his lightning abilities, and I believe I've managed to do that through some spells and features quite well. Other than that, the main thing I was focusing on were the rules for Mjolnir and Stormbreaker, for which I've created some homebrew mechanics. Thor is a god, or in the case of Marvel, an alien, neither of which fit cleanly into a Dungeons & Dragons race. The closest option, I think, is Aasimar, which is essentially a demigod. The Aasimar race is from Volo's Guide to Monsters, and gives us +2 to Charisma. We also gain resistance to necrotic and radiant damage, as well as healing hands, which is very useful. Then we get the light cantrip, and the languages Common and Celestial. Finally, for subrace, I went for Protector Aasimar, which gives an additional +1 to Wisdom and the ability Radiant Soul. Thor's class choice is going to be relatively easy, but I have something I need to cover first. People who have watched my other videos will know that I tend to add homebrew weapons and abilities into them to add a bit more flavour, and Thor will be no exception. In this case, I've designed stats for Thor's weapons, which covers their unique abilities. The reason I bring this up now is because I would recommend taking a different class choice if you don't want to use these homebrew additions. In this case, you would want to put 3 levels into Fighter and be an Eldritch Knight, which will give you some abilities to cover the weapon's powers. So now for the actual class choice, I went for Cleric, which seems strange, but stay with me. All levels will be going into this class, and we will be taking the Tempest domain. This domain is something I used in the past when making a Cleric, and I essentially made a character that felt like playing as Thor purely by accident. The god Thor is even mentioned by name in the domain description. I built this character to be level 8, and I will go through some of the abilities now and cover the spells later. First we gain proficiency in martial weapons and medium armour, as well as the ability Wrath of the Storm, which allows us to call in lightning strikes on opponents as a reaction. Then we have Channel Divinity, which has a variety of possible uses. Firstly, we have Turn Undead, and because we're above level 5, Destroy Undead, which causes nearby undead to flee and will destroy any that are below a challenge rating of 1. Then from our domain, we have Destructive Wrath, which allows us to use our Channel Divinity whenever we deal lightning damage to cause maximum damage instead of rolling. Next we have Thunderbolt Strike, allowing us to push enemies of size large or smaller back up to 10 feet when we hit them with lightning damage. Finally, we have Divine Strike, which allows us to deal an extra d8 thunder damage when we hit with weapon attacks, which is very similar to how Thor channels his lightning through his weapons. This takes the character up to level 8, but if you want to take it further, I would recommend just putting more levels into this same class. At 17th level, you will gain the ability to fly like Thor, and if you want, you can always put some levels into Fighter, as I mentioned earlier. For Thor's equipment, we will of course be using the Cleric starting options, firstly taking the Warhammer, then the Chainmail, and a Light Hammer. Finally, an Explorer's Pack and a Shield. We also get a Holy Symbol to channel magic through, but in the case of Thor, Mjolnir is usually what he uses to channel his power. So I would make the Light Hammer be the holy symbol. Now, for the homebrew weapons, we will be swapping the Light Hammer out for Mjolnir and the Warhammer for Stormbreaker. I've got some stats for Mjolnir here, and I based it on the stats for the Light Hammer already in the game, but for a magic weapon like this, the damage seemed too low, so I've increased it to have a +2 to attack and damage. Then we have the abilities of the hammer. Firstly is If He Be Worthy, which states that this hammer can be wielded by anyone who is deemed worthy by the hammer, and it cannot be lifted by any other creature. It's up to the Dungeon Master to decide who the hammer thinks is worthy based on alignment and stuff like that. Then there is Bound Weapon. This weapon has a flying speed of 40 feet, and can be controlled by Thor providing it is within 500 feet of him. Thor must remain concentrated on the weapon to target things with it, but does not need to concentrate to recall the weapon to him, that just costs a bonus action. I think this covers the weapon pretty well. The damage is still kind of low, but it will be increased when the character's lightning abilities are added to the attacks. Next we have Stormbreaker, which is based on a battle axe instead of a great axe, purely so that I can dual wield it with Mjolnir. The weapon can be thrown, unlike most battle axes, but the weapon must be being used with two hands to do so. Much like Mjolnir, Stormbreaker can also be recalled to the player as a bonus action, with a flying speed of 30 feet. This weapon has also received a +2 to attack and damage. This means that Mjolnir is capable of being used more effectively at range, but Stormbreaker does more damage. The final homebrew edition I have is more of just a roleplay one, but it's called Ready for Battle. It takes a bonus action to perform, but it causes a bolt of lightning to hit Thor from the sky, causing him to instantly change from whatever clothes he is wearing into his battle armour, which is naturally inspired by what we see the character do in Avengers Endgame. Now, moving on to spells, because we're playing as a cleric, we will have access to all of the class's spells, and just need to decide on which ones we want to use each day. Some areas to focus on are of course lightning and thunder spells, in particular the ones given to us as part of the Tempest domain. Other than that, just focus on good spells to buff your combat ability. Things like Resistance and Shield of Faith are good choices. For ability scores, Strength and Wisdom will be a priority for combat and spellcasting. Then Constitution and Dexterity, and finally Intelligence and Charisma will not be very important. For background, you have options depending on which version of Thor you want to reflect and where you want him to be personality-wise. He is a warrior, and he loves being in battle, which would be well covered by the soldier background. This is a good choice if you're focusing more on the Norse god of Thor or early version of the MCU character. Alternatively, Noble is a better representation of the Marvel character we see in later films and most of the comics as a leader of Asgard. I chose the soldier background, and the personality traits I picked are currently on screen. Finally, for alignment, I think Thor fits somewhere on the good side of things, but where exactly depends on where your inspiration for the character is coming from. I personally went for chaotic good. For skills, we get athletics and intimidation from our background, and 2 cleric skills, for which I took history and religion. We also have 2 ability score increases to work with, for which I recommend the feats Great Weapon Master and Savage Attacker to improve combat ability. That's the character finished. As always, the character sheet can be found in the description, along with a playlist containing some of my other videos making characters in Dungeons & Dragons. My upload frequency has gone down a bit recently. This is because I'm working on some slightly bigger videos that will be coming out in the next few months, covering more homebrew focused topics, so be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see that.